the Time Machine Teacher, and today we are doing Unit 6. On this channel, we talk all things AP World History and World History in general. If that sounds like something you're interested in, make sure and subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a thing. Okay, grab your notebooks. Let's get started with Unit 6. First and foremost, let's talk about context. Going into Unit 6, which is 1750 to 1900, we have a lot of technological change, which is paving the way for imperialism. The Industrial Revolution happens. Remember, it starts in Great Britain and spreads throughout Europe. As new technology is created, more industrialization happens as a result, and there is more competition between industrializing states for the raw materials that they need in order to manufacture. You could say that imperialism is an effect of the Industrial Revolution because they're going around imperializing and competing for these raw materials in order to industrialize more and make more money. During this time frame, the power of the Spanish and the Portuguese also declines, while the power of Great Britain, France, and Russia increases, and the US and Japan get in on imperialism as well. In 6.1, the ideologies of imperialism are discussed. First of all, ideologies are just basically the ideas or the thoughts promoting imperialism. How do they justify it? Nationalism starts to grow during this time period where the European states want to be better than other European states. Britain loses control of the American colonies because they lose the American Revolution, and therefore they lose a lot of access to raw materials. They will imperialize all over the world. There's a saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire, which basically means that somewhere in the British Empire, the sun is always out. Like it's daytime somewhere in the British Empire. And that just shows the immense amount of colonies that Great Britain had. For example, they will spread into Australia and start penal colonies, which is a colony where they send criminals. The criminals that are sent to Australia end up forming that colony and working to build it. They also gradually take over South Asia, such as India, Myanmar, Borneo, Sri Lanka, and Singapore. They're going to have a hand in going into China and several other places throughout the world. France will also imperialize. They occupy Algeria, islands of the South Pacific, Senegal, and Indochina. Italy and Germany start imperializing around the mid-1880s. Spain had colonies in the 1500s and 1600s, but they don't really play a part in imperializing because by that time, their power had declined. Japan decides also to imperialize. Keep in mind that they have industrialized because of the Meiji Restoration, and so they're kind of on the same playing field, and they are spurred on by nationalism and wanting to get their culture out there. Their first target is Korea. However, China doesn't like their encroachment on Korea, and they fight a war with Japan called the Sino-Japanese War in 1894 to 1895. The Japanese win and take over Korea. They also take over Taiwan. There are also cultural and religious ideologies that spur on this idea of imperialism. One of those ideologies is a cultural justification for it. And we see this in Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, where he says that natives are children and they need the help of the white man to go in and help them improve their culture. This was a justification used by the Europeans that they were actually going in and helping the natives. Now, once we look at imperialism a little bit closer, we see that this in fact is not true, that they were exploiting the natives for the most part, and also treating them like slaves in most areas. However, this was an idea that the Europeans clung to in order to justify their going into these distant lands. Racism was also spurred on and backed up by what they said was science. This specific science was studied by phrenologists who said that the size of skulls that belonged to specific ethnic groups determined how racially superior they were. Of course, they explained that because of the size and structure of European skulls, that Europeans were superior to the natives. That was later proved false But this idea kind of stuck around and helped justify the Europeans' takeover during imperialism. Another ideology that came about was social Darwinism, and this was influenced by Charles Darwin's idea of the survival of the fittest. In social Darwinism, they liken that to the best race of people that is superior to others will survive, will be better with certain things, or be superior, and that because of social Darwinism, those superior races should rule the other races. This, of course, was a very racist ideology and not at all true, but because Europeans were more advanced, they felt as though they were a superior culture. Never mind that a lot of those inventions came from China and the Middle East, and that there are theories as to why the Europeans were able to become more advanced than other people during that time. Never mind all that. It's because of social Darwinism. At least that's what they adhered to. And because European cultures were superior to native cultures, that was used as justification as well. We have guns, we have swords, we have all of this that makes us more powerful than you, so therefore we are superior. That was their idea. Colonizers went in and introduced their culture as being superior to native cultures and tried to get the natives to assimilate into Western ideas by changing their language, their religion, their way of dress, education. They spread Christianity through missionaries as well as schools, which was one of their motivations for going in and imperializing. Not only are they helping the natives by bringing them technology and new things, they're also converting them to Christianity, so they're saving their souls as well. Also, of course, there's always economic motivation. Europeans were always seeking more profits and seeking places where they could set up trading posts. Some examples would be the East India Trading Company, which controlled India for the British, and the Dutch East India Trading Company, which controlled South Africa and southern South America. As the Industrial Revolution spread and progressed, more and more raw materials were needed, and therefore the competition and the economic motivation increased as well. 6.2 and 6.3 go over the processes of state expansion as well as the internal and external factors in state building. I'm going to lump those two together because they're very similar and there's several events that overlap anyway. So just to make a little bit more sense, I'm putting them together. The slave trade is abolished by the 1800s. However, what replaces that is coerced labor in many of the colonies that were imperialized. Europeans want gold, palm oil, ivory, and diamonds from Africa. At first, when they arrived in Africa, malaria was a huge problem. Remember back when the Europeans go to the New World and they spread diseases and make all the Native Americans sick? The opposite happens in Africa because the Africans mostly had immunity to European diseases because of contact with them before. However, the Europeans had never experienced malaria, and that made them very sick, and it was very hard for them to live in Africa. Eventually, quinine is discovered, which helps Europeans to be able to overcome that disease and enables them to live there for longer time frames. Another invention that helped the Europeans in Africa was the steamship. This made transportation deeper into Africa possible. In Egypt, the British decided to build the Suez Canal. This would enable them to get from the Mediterranean Sea into the Red Sea and get to India faster. And keep in mind, this had been a goal for a very long time. How can they get to India faster and more efficiently? Many of the workers who built the Suez Canal were called corvée laborers, or unpaid workers. The British also had a presence in West Africa, in what is known as modern-day Sierra Leone, Gambia, Ghana, the Gold Coast, and there they established teaching language and Western ways to the natives, as well as converting them to Christianity. The French were in Algeria. Algeria becomes a settlers colony that attracts immigrants, and they also set up trading posts there to compete with the British trading post. During this time frame is what's called the Scramble for Africa, where all of the European countries are trying to get their hands on any raw materials, any areas that they can claim in Africa. And to do this, they had what was called the Berlin Conference. This was headed up by Otto von Bismarck. His sole purpose of having this meeting was so that the Europeans wouldn't fight over where they were going to take colonies in Africa. One thing they forgot to do was invite African chiefs to the table. And as they were dividing up Africa amongst the European countries, they did not keep in mind the rival tribes of the area. So oftentimes, rival tribes were put into the same colony, which is going to cause problems down the road, like the genocide in Rwanda. There were also problems in South Africa. The Dutch had been in charge of South Africa for a while. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British take South Africa from the Dutch, but they allow the Dutch settlers who were living there, who are called the Afrikaners, to continue speaking their language. The Afrikaners, who are the Dutch settlers, or the descendants of the Dutch settlers, don't get along with the native South Africans who live there. This will cause what's called the Boer Wars. At the end of those wars, the British forced the Afrikaners and the native South Africans out of the area into concentration camps that are segregated. During this time as well, millions were displaced from their farms, a very bad time in South Africa. Belgium controlled the Congo. At the beginning, King Leopold ruled. And he ruled with an iron fist, which means that he ruled so harshly that many natives died under his commands and his laws that he placed on the Congo. It was so harsh, in fact, that the British government ends up taking over from him and not allowing him to rule anymore. King Leopold does use the profits from imperialism to industrialize Belgium. So basically, they industrialized their country on the backs of the natives of the Congo. The term slave was not used anymore. However, the Congolese were definitely treated as slaves. It is thought that around 8 million lost their lives during King Leopold's rule of the Congo. Modern-day Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent during this time, while the rest of Africa is imperialized. On to imperialism in South Asia. The French are kicked out of South Asia after losing the 7 Years' War, aka the French and Indian War, and the British move in. When the British move into India, they start recruiting Indian natives for the military. They're called sepoys. In 1857, the sepoys rebel against the British. They were upset because the gun cartridges were greased with animal fat. And therefore, in order to load your gun, you had to rip it off with your mouth and get the animal fat within your body. This is a problem for Muslims because they don't eat pork. It's also a problem for Hindus because they respect the cow as the sacred animal. Not only were they upset about the greasing of the cartridges, there was also growing resentment against the British for their general treatment of the sepoys to begin with. Therefore, the sepoys rebelled against the British. This rebellion was shut down by the British, but it was the first time that the Muslims and Hindus unite against a common enemy, and nationalism as seen as a result. In 1858, the British Raj was set up. It was a colonial government run by the British that took orders directly from the government in London. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was formed, which was originally set up to air grievances to Britain from the colonists, but eventually will lead to wanting self-rule. On now to imperialism in East Asia. Let me set you up with a little bit of timeline with what's going on in China, and then we'll talk about the events a little bit more in depth. China is very isolated from the rest of the world. They tried to keep the Westerners out. However, the First Opium War starts because the British want to be able to get in and trade more, and the Chinese are saying no. That happens from 1839 to 1842. The British win, and as a result, get more access to China to be able to trade opium and other items. Despite the fact that the Chinese government doesn't want this to happen, because they lose the war, they have to allow it. The Taiping Rebellion then happens from 1850 to 1864, which we'll talk about in detail in just a minute. While that is going on, the Second Opium War occurs from 1856 to 1860. The British end up winning that as well, and opening China to even more trade and outside influence. The Boxer Rebellion occurs in 1899 to 1901, and spheres of influence will be set up in the late 1800s into the 1900s. Let's rewind a little bit. First Opium War, we know happens because the British want to go in and trade more, and the Chinese won't allow it. Because of the treaty that was signed, China is opened up more to the outside world. The Taiping Rebellion occurs in 1850 because of internal challenges within the Qing dynasty. It's led by a guy named Huang, who has a religious experience where he believes God tells him to lead this rebellion. His following increases with peasants and workers who are working under horrible conditions in China and want to rebel against that. The Qing dynasty shuts it down with the help of Western powers in 1864. It gets much worse because during the rebellion, the Yellow River floods and causes a huge famine. Farms are destroyed in this flood, and therefore many people are starving. Also during the rebellion, the Second Opium War breaks out. So the Qing dynasty has to deal with this as well. And if that were not enough, the bubonic plague also breaks out during this time within China. More than 20 million Chinese died throughout this time frame, and it eventually leads to the end of the dynastic rule in China. They definitely lost the mandate of heaven. The Taiping Rebellion ends in 1864. The Boxer Rebellion starts in 1899. This one was led by the Boxers, who were an anti-imperialist group and supported by the Empress. They set out to rid China of foreigners and Christians by killing them. The dynasty suffered a great defeat from this, and as a result lost legitimacy. Spheres of influence start to be established within China, where the French, the British, the Russian, US, and the Japanese come in and take over areas economically and ask for the same trading privileges that Great Britain has. Let's go back to Japan for a minute. As we said before, they industrialize in the Meiji Restoration. They want to imperialize as well. They encouraged the Colonization Society, which sent contract workers to places like Hawaii and Guam, empires in East Asia, and colonies in Latin America. In Southeast Asia, the Dutch East India Company, say that 5 times, took control of the Spice Islands from the Portuguese. The Dutch government eventually takes control from the Dutch East India Company because they were corrupt, and their large plantations produced cash crops for the Dutch. The French have rubber plantations in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, which as a whole is called Indochina. The British also have a presence in South Asia, in Malaya, where they grow cash crops for profit, and eventually Malaya becomes the largest rubber producer. The US also gets in on imperialism. President James Monroe comes out with the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically telling the Europeans that they cannot interfere with anything that's going on in the Western Hemisphere. They have to basically keep their nose out of it. There were also problems within the US with Native American tribes. One example was the Cherokee tribe, who at the time lived in the southern US area. This tribe was unique in that they tried to assimilate to Western ways by changing their style of dress, learning English, educating themselves in English ways, also making a written form of their language, learning to farm, and they were told that they would be able to stay on their lands because of that. Unfortunately, gold was found in some of the areas that they lived, and suddenly their land became even more valuable to the U.S. That's when the Indian Removal Act was issued by President Andrew Jackson, which has been a huge debate lately because there are several who would like to see his face taken off of the $20 bill because of his actions with the Cherokee and the Indian Removal Act as a whole. Despite the fact that they had assimilated, they were removed by the Army and sent to Oklahoma on what was called the Trail of Tears. It's a very dark time in U.S. history for sure. There was also resistance among the Paiute Native Americans. They thought that they could drive the white people from the land if they asked their ancestors' help through what was called the ghost dance. Unfortunately, this did not work, and the Native Americans as a whole were eventually driven out, killed, or put on reservations. During the time of imperialism, there was also a war between the US and Mexico, where we took land from Mexico in the Southwest, a concept called manifest destiny, which justified the expansion to the West. The US government claimed that it was our destiny to expand all the way to the Pacific, and it didn't matter what stood in our way, we were going to get there. The Spanish-American War also takes place during this time, with the US winning and gaining Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The Hawaiian monarchy is overthrown by American planters, and Hawaii would become a part of the United States in 1900. When President Roosevelt became president, he was a big activist for social Darwinism, and that was the justification that he used to be able to go in and get any Latin American country that was unstable. There are 3 types of imperialism I feel that it's important that you know. Number 1, a state-run colony. One example of this would be the Belgium Congo. In a state-run colony, Western ways replace native ways. They usually justify it by saying they're helping the natives, but the results are usually exploitation, loss of native culture, creation of new social classes, and the rule of government through Western policies. Number 2, a settler colony. An example of this would be British South Africa. The characteristics of this is that the imperializing nation would come in and control and use the land in the colony. Settlers coming in would remove the indigenous population or replace them. The results of this usually led to loss of land, sometimes genocide, the spread of disease, forced conversion of the natives to Western ideals, and natives driven into poverty. And the third type is economic domination. An example of this is Britain going into China. In this category, raw materials are exploited, low wages are paid, local government is weakened but still allowed to maintain some control. There is usually social destabilization, which is based on economic exploitation. Because cash crops are normally grown in order to benefit the imperializing country, monocultures come into existence, which means that only one crop is grown, which then leads to a lack of agricultural diversity, soil depletion, and damage to the environment. Russians also expanded during this time frame. We talked briefly in the last unit about how Ivan the Terrible expanded for the fur trade during his reign. Catherine the Great will also expand. She reigns from 1762 to 1796. During her reign, she annexes half of Poland and takes some of the Ottoman Empire as well. The life for the peasants during her reign is deplorable. Pugachev forms a rebellion to go up against her. Unfortunately, that is shut down by Catherine the Great's troops. After her reign in the 1800s, Russia continues to expand and competes with Great Britain for Afghanistan. They also go into China, and they end up with a part of Manchuria. Other resistance includes the Taiping Rebellion. This takes place in Latin America, and he is eventually rounded up and executed with his family for rebelling against the government there. In 1863, Napoleon works with conservative Mexicans to overthrow the government and place Maximilian as an emperor. Napoleon started to imperialize Mexico through that time, but in 1867, Maximilian was overthrown and executed. In South Asia, we have the internal challenge of the Taiping Rebellion in India, which we discussed earlier in this video. Southeast Asia also sees its share of rebellions, specifically in the Philippines. Jose Rizal is an educated reformer in the Philippines, and he starts the Philippine League. The Spanish fear this and arrested him. Revolts break out, which starts the Philippine Revolution. In 1898, the Spanish-American War breaks out. The Americans win and are given the Philippines. And then the Philippine-American War breaks out because the Filipinos want their independence. The Americans win that war, but struggles will continue for independence until they finally get it in 1906. Australia and New Zealand also have problems because of their native people there. In Australia, the native people are known as Aboriginal people. This is one of the oldest continual cultures on Earth. When the penal colonies are set up by the British, this disturbs the Aboriginal environment, and thousands of them are killed during that time. In New Zealand, the Maori Wars break out with the indigenous people there. They don't want the settlers to take any more of their land, but by the 1900s, Most of the Maori are driven from their land. African resistance is also present during this time. By the end of World War I, there's a concept known as Pan-Africanism, where all educated Africans look at themselves as having the same identity and nationalism. And they try to work together in order to get imperializing nations out of Africa. The Hausa people rebelled against the British by killing their animals and by burning their crops, in hopes that their ancestors would drive the British out of the land. The British were not thrown out, and a large famine occurred, killing many. The Zulu also went to war with the British, but they were defeated, and their land became British South Africa. In West Africa, Samori Toure went to war with the French. After fighting with the French for several years, he was eventually sent into exile. All indigenous responses usually led to rebellion against the imperial powers, which were then usually shut down by the imperial powers because of their superior weaponry and technology, as well as their resources. Moving on now to 6.4, which is about environmental factors of imperialism, and how those factors contribute to a global economy during 1750 to 1900. The Industrial Revolution definitely affects travel and communication. It improves it. Railroads, for example, is one way these improvements happen. Railroads were needed to get from the interior to the ports in order to ship raw materials. Because few roads were available, railroads become even more important in order to do this, and this was one of the ways that the imperial powers claimed they were helping the natives. Cecil Rhodes is one example of this. He invested money in a railroad to connect Cape Town with Cairo. Workers were Native Africans and were paid very little in order to build this railroad. Steamships were also very important. However, they required a lot of coal in order to run. So they could only travel limited distances at first, but by the 1870s they were more advanced. Steamships greatly helped in South Asia and in Africa. The telegraph also made it possible for information to travel instantly, so it improves communication drastically. Most of the places that the imperial powers were going into survived on sustenance farming, which means that they grew just enough for them to eat and sell a little bit. However, that changes when the imperial powers go in and want them to start growing cash crops, such as tea, cotton, sugar. It reduces the amount of food available in the colony, and sometimes increases the price of food or results in a famine. Because of raw materials being exported, the export economies grew in the colonies. Cotton was a big export going to Britain because they had a high demand for it. At first it comes from the US, but during the Civil War they start to get more of their cotton from Egypt and India. Rubber was taken from the rubber trees in South America. Natives were forced to extract it, and rubber barons were the ones that were mainly making the money off of this. The natives worked in slave-like conditions under the rubber barons. Palm oil was used to oil the factories of the Industrial Revolution as well as make candles. It is an important cash crop of West Africa. Palm oil plantations were established there. Ivory coming from Africa became piano keys and billiards and knife handles for those in Europe. Minerals around the world, such as silver in Mexico and copper in Chile, and the diamonds in Africa, were sent as exports to the imperializing nations. Cecil Rhodes owned De Beers Diamond Company and controlled 90% of the world's diamond production. Rhodes later becomes the Prime Minister of South Africa, where his racist policies will eventually pave the way for apartheid, which was the separation of the races, much like segregation in the United States. Global consequences of the Industrial Revolution led to many things. Urban population grows. The demand for food increases as farmers switch to farming cash crops mostly, which will then lead to monocultures, deforestation, and the nutrient depletion of the soil. 6.5 covers economic imperialism. This happens when foreign businessmen invest in the colonial economies. We already discussed that economic factors of imperialism were the want of raw materials, and that oftentimes the resources and the people are exploited. An example of economic imperialism is Great Britain going into China. They take access and power through the Opium Wars, which was also discussed earlier in the video. Economic imperialism also takes place in Africa, where it creates an unequal trade structure and made Africans very dependent on Europeans. Growing too many cash crops caused food prices to rise and famines to happen as well. Economic imperialism in Latin America occurred through the United States and Great Britain. The United States had money to invest from the Second Industrial Revolution, and that's when they started going into Latin America to invest that money. Great Britain also invested in building railroads in Argentina, as well as invested in ranches of Argentina. Mining in Chile increased, and the amount of rubber coming from Brazil also increased. In Central America, there were many politically unstable areas, and the exploitation of limited resources such as bananas and minerals began. These were called banana republics. 6.6 covers environmental and economic forces of migration. There are several push and pull factors that cause people to migrate throughout the world during this time. Laborers were needed on plantations. Laborers from India went to British colonies. Chinese often went to California as well as British Malaya. The Japanese sent people to Hawaii, Peru, Cuba to work on plantations there. The slave trade had been abolished, but coerced labor replaces it. And that comes in several forms, sometimes in the form of indentured servants, where there's a certain amount of time that the servant works off his indenture or her indenture. Asian contract laborers, where laborers are often forced or tricked into servitude and treated very harshly in the process. The British and the French both had penal colonies where they used criminals for labor. The British in Australia, the French in Africa, New Caledonia, and French Guinea. As a result of all this migration, a diaspora happens, which is the spreading out of people throughout the world. Poverty is a push factor in which people are pushed out of wherever they're living in order to find better and higher standard of living. An example would be the poverty in India leads to many leaving as indentured servants. Another example would be the Chinese going to the US for the gold rush. Most of those going were illiterate and landless peasants, and many left during the Taiping Rebellion, which was another push factor to get out of there. The Irish sometimes left because of political reasons, as well as the potato famine, which destroyed the potato crop and led to famine. There was also a lot of migration to settler colonies. Those who went to live in the colonies were mostly there to govern or be in the military. Some were also technical experts that helped to build infrastructure within the colonies. British investors migrated to Argentina for more opportunities. The Japanese Colonization Society is another example of migrating to settler colonies. Unfortunately, there were tensions between those who migrated and those who were already there. For example, in the US, there was a lot of tension against the Chinese, the Japanese, and sometimes the Irish during different periods of immigration. In 6.7, we see how and why immigration affects society. There are for sure changes in the home society. Most of the people who are migrating are males, leaving females at home. Sometimes another male in the family would come and take over in that area, or the females would sometimes jump into the male role as well. Usually the male who was leaving would send money back home in order to try and improve the lives of those back home. There were also effects on receiving societies. Ethnic enclaves start up in the receiving societies, which are parts of town that an ethnic community would form. For example, Chinatown or Little Italy. It felt more like home for them to live together, and it was more comfortable since they knew the language. They also brought with them their culture and their traditions, which mixed into the receiving society. Gandhi lived in South Africa for a while, where he fought against discrimination there because he didn't like how the British were treating the Indians. When he later returns to India, he will continue that work towards trying to get independence for the Indians. There were also systems in place that would enable your family to work together. For example, Indians in Southeast Asia worked on the Kangani system, which put whole families together working on plantations. Irish enclaves were in the northern United States. Many Irish would come over and work in the factories or help to build the canals. Some single Irish women also came over looking for work and husbands, and usually ended up working as domestic servants or sometimes in the factories. They also brought with them their holidays and culture. Italians in Argentina were pull factor, to Argentina by the opportunities there. They were paid higher wages than in Italy, and there was a lower cost of living, which is a huge pull factor. As we discussed earlier, prejudice and discrimination occurred. In the U.S., regulations were passed against immigration. In 1879, they were prevented from getting jobs, and they were encouraged to live in segregated towns. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, which banned the immigration of the Chinese into the United States. Some began to work in Mexico, where they were welcomed to work on the railroad and in the mines there. The U.S. was not the only place that this happened. Australia passed a Chinese Act in 1885, which limited the number of Chinese immigrants. And during that time, some Chinese miners were attacked by white miners. In 1901, the White Australia policy was passed to preserve white Australia and wasn't lifted until the 1970s. 6.8 discusses causation of imperialism, specifically effects. Industrial production increases because of automation, the assembly line, interchangeable parts, and specialization of labor. All of these things improve efficiency in production, as well as increased output. The standard of living slowly increases. The wages also slowly increase. However, the distribution of wealth becomes more obvious. Because of production increasing, there are too many goods to sell on the domestic market, and the exporting market increases, which leads to more international trade. And that wraps up Unit 6 of the amazing review Race to a 5. Thank you so much for watching, and stick around for the outtakes. I'll see you next time. As I said before, as the Industrial Revolution, this made the rivers navigable in Southeast Asia. The dust in Southeast Asia, oh my gosh,